Darling one, you were born from the sweetest love, cast from the fires of creation, burning bright into the making of your perfect constellations. Head high, my love, never let them diminish you. Stand tall in the power of your love. Break open to the thousands come before you, written in your heart with holy blood. Keep going, my love. Hold tight to the scripture of your inheritance, your dreams born from ancient stone. Weave your magic star of wisdom, breathing life into hollow bones. Courage, my love. Place pain upon your sacred altars. Grow seeds where life has become hopeless. Lend hands to those who fall and falter. Let love be life's greatest opus.
Welcome, beautiful souls. My name is Tara Brading, and I'm the creator of the Dreaming the Ancestors podcast series, where we talk about remembering and reclaiming ancestral stories, feminine wisdom, and earth magic. This is the 17th episode, and today I'm very excited to welcome Gwilym Morus Baird to the podcast. Gwilym is a Welsh musician, storyteller, author, and teacher. He's the founder of CelticSource.online, providing courses on Celtic myth and history. He's also worked as a composer, production researcher, and consultant, as a fellow at the Library of Congress, Washington, D.C., and was one of the founders of EOS, the broadcasting rights agency for Wales. He continues to compose, perform, write, teach, consult, and make videos. I'm so honored to be here with Gwilym. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here. Gwilym, feel free to say a quick hello to everyone who's listening.
Well, hello, and thank you very much for the invite.
Thank you, Gwilym. We're going to take a moment here to, as always, open this space and honor and welcome in the ancestors to be here with us for this conversation. And I invite you to imagine that we're having this conversation in the flesh, heart to heart, and we're sitting on the ground around a great fire. And I invite us to imagine, sense, and feel that we are weaving together through this conversation. We're sharing wisdom and stories like our ancestors have done since the very beginning of time. And as we hold this vision in our hearts and minds of being gathered around the fire, I'd like to take a moment to honor the ancestors. So I'd like to honor the ancestors of the land, really honoring the ancestors of Britain in particular for this conversation, honoring the ancestors from the lands that we now call England and Wales. And I invite us to really honor these ancestors in a way that open our hearts to all that we share and all that makes us different. And I really invite us to imagine these ancestors gathering around us. The newer ancestors, the more ancient ancestors who understood the cycles and seasons, who lived in season with the rhythms of the land, and who honored the stars and the skies above. Honoring all of these ancestors who long to be with us for this conversation, welcoming them into our circle. Thank you, beloved ancestors. The title of this episode is Welsh Spirituality and Cultural Appropriation. And I'm really excited about this conversation because we're going to talk about and explore the importance of distinguishing Welsh culture from English culture. And this is why I just called in the ancestors of Wales and England. And my intention is that this conversation will be meaningful and inspiring for folks who either have Welsh or English ancestry and heritage. This topic became particularly important to me when I decided to get serious about exploring and connecting with my English ancestry and heritage a number of years ago. And I actually came across such a wonderful video from Gwilym on YouTube about Celtic spirituality, cultural appropriation, and cultural misrepresentation. And so I wanted to invite Gwilym to have this conversation, as I learned so much from this video and it really resonated so deeply. To begin this conversation, it feels important to acknowledge that England and Wales were once part of Brythonic Britain, but there's been so much history and antagonism between these two nations for the past 1,000 years or so. And the history of oppression in Wales is still deeply felt, especially in regards to the Welsh language. And what I've noticed is that in modern paganism, there are lots of well-meaning English people who want to connect with our pre-Christian, earth-honoring Brythonic past, but then inadvertently appropriate from the Welsh traditions or misrepresent the Welsh culture. And there's a lot of complexity and nuance to explore here, because for those of us with English ancestry, we do have roots in Brythonic Britain, but we also very much have our own identity. And as a nation, of course, we have a violent and oppressive history, especially our more recent history, and we're not considered a Celtic nation like our neighbours in Wales, Cornwall, and Scotland. So there's a lot to explore here in regards to cultural appropriation and misrepresentation, and I'm excited to dig into some of these complexities with Gwilym, and also to uplift Welsh spirituality in a modern context. So Gwilym, could you start us off by sharing how you became interested in the Welsh traditions? Did you grow up steeped in Welsh spirituality, or is this something that you found later in life?
Okay, big questions to begin with. Yes, I was raised in a Welsh family, in a broadly Welsh-speaking community, although we were a minority Welsh-speaking community in a larger English town, if you like, or English-speaking town, even though the town I grew up in is in Wales. And, I think we've got to be clear that there isn't a surviving pagan tradition in any of the Celtic lands, as in a tradition of what you might call priests or ceremonial leaders or, shamans even, if you want to use that term, which is, of course, itself problematic. But what we do have is a very vibrant and strong culture. And for me, culture is spirituality, if you like. We experience this crazy reality that we live in, mediated through our cultures. So for me, culture is spirituality. So in that sense, yes, I was raised in a Welsh spirituality, just not a spirituality as we might formulate it in the modern sense, as in practices and ceremonies or fetishes or altars or explicit beliefs and mythologies and deities, but definitely spiritual. And, one of the more potent spiritual experiences I had growing up in that community was singing. So singing in the school choir, singing all kinds of things from hymns to madrigals to, traditional Welsh material. But singing in harmony was an intense cultural, spiritual experience for me. So that's the main one. But I'm aware that it's probably not the type of spirituality that modern folks in the Anglo-American culture are going to expect, if you like. To get to that type of spirituality, we need to do a lot more work, if you like, because we don't have an existing lineage in that sense, beyond Christianity, of course. Christianity being the dominant religion on these lands for the last 1,500 years.
And what was it that sparked your interest in, let's say, Welsh mythology, which is, a big part of your teaching, as far as I understand?
Yeah, so I'd always wanted to connect in a more serious way to my culture and my tradition. And for cultural/spiritual reasons, in modern Wales, we live in an English-speaking environment, even though we have Welsh-speaking relationships within our families and our sort of smaller communities. So it's very easy as a Welsh speaker to feel overwhelmed or drowned out by Anglo-American culture. So not just the English-speaking culture of Britain, as in England and Wales, English-speaking Wales, but, broadly, the United States, Canada, Australia, these all create what you might call the Anglo-American world. And it's such a dominant and bright and shining and attractive culture. It's very easy to get caught up in it. And I was a musician as a young man, a Welsh language musician, singing in Welsh singing, Welsh folk music, very earnestly with my guitar, traveling around the countryside. I did other types of music too, but, that was my main interest, was how do I connect more with this tradition of my family, of, what you might call my people. And to do that, you either go to university and you study formally, which is what I ended up doing, or the other way, of course, is you get involved in Welsh media, or you get involved in Welsh chapel culture. For what, nothing against the Christians, but I didn't have much interest in Welsh chapel culture. It felt a bit boring to me. So I was interested in the older roots of my tradition, which is how I ended up researching and learning about, and today, I suppose, still researching and learning about, but also teaching about Welsh myth and the broader set of Celtic myths that Welsh myths are sort of nested within. Yeah, so it's a long answer to a relatively straightforward situation. I wanted to connect more with my people,
Completely understand that longing and that calling, and many people listening have felt that in some way, shape, or form. So we're going to talk quite a bit about cultural appropriation and cultural misrepresentation in this conversation. So I think it would be helpful if you could just give us an overview of what these terms mean from your perspective.
So cultural appropriation is quite a modern idea, although, it's probably an ancient experience. Cultural appropriation in the broader sense is really the feeling had by a subjugated culture that a dominant culture has not only taken over their lands and their resources, but is now sort of cherry picking their culture and taking their culture. So there's the power dynamic involved. Subjugated culture has no say over its resources or its space, and increasingly has no say over its internal life either, its culture. And obviously you need a dominant culture in that dynamic to sort of do the appropriating. Now that's different, and I think this is where some critics of cultural appropriation get confused, is that's different to cultural influence. We can't help but be influenced by each other. I think cultural influence is great. I'm a kind of a universalist at heart. I think that all humans are equal and that we should all live together in one big, peaceful, happy family and try and get on with each other as much as possible and allow for difference, but also connect when we can connect. And so, being influenced by other people's cultures is fine. It's very human. I think it's important. I think it leads to greater understanding and peace and sharing. So, I think we've got to distinguish between appropriation and influence to begin with. Influence, good. Appropriation, bad. Of course, you can perhaps appropriate without even knowing it. And, that's kind of a blameless appropriation because you're not doing it out of a sense of malevolence or because you want to punish someone or be dominant, but just because you happen to be part of a dominant culture that you just might be ignorant of the history, yeah? Which is the situation a lot of us find ourselves in these days. I am at once the member of a subjugated people, but also member of a broader culture which has itself subjugated other people. The Welsh aren't totally innocent in colonialism, for example, So we all play these different parts at different moments in our cultural experience. What I am most interested in is misrepresentation. So appropriation, we can criticize and point to and say, don't do that, that's bad. Please stop. Cultural influence, we can say, that's great. Please keep doing that. Please let's share in a world culture. Let's be together as a human family. Let's, acknowledge ourselves as basically the same people speaking in and acting and behaving in different ways, in a variety of ways, with a rich diversity of culture. All good. Misrepresentation, on the other hand, I think is even, it's more of a problem than appropriation, because appropriation is largely from ignorance. And when it's done out of malevolence, it's really easy to criticize. But misrepresentation is a little bit more subtle and it's a bit more problematic because you're saying something that's not true, not just about another culture, but about someone else's identity. And this is why culture is spiritual for me, is because my culture is my identity. I understand myself on the deepest of levels, on the profoundest of levels, through my culture. I can't help that. That's how I was raised. These are the languages I speak. These are the cultures I'm involved in. And so when someone misrepresents my culture, they're also misrepresenting me and my ancestors and my family and my people. And that means that I no longer have claim over my identity and I no longer have sovereignty, or someone is impacting my sovereignty as a cultural being, So that's where misrepresentation is a problem, is saying something that's not true about someone else's history. And there's loads of ways that happens. Is that a decent enough potted history on the terms?
Yes, that's so helpful. And I think, you've really spoken to the nuances and the subtleties of these terms and also the lived experience of them. So I think that's really helpful. So could you give us an example of the Welsh traditions being culturally appropriated, or perhaps more accurately misrepresented by, let's say, Robert Graves, just to help make this more tangible for people listening? And maybe you have some other examples as well.
Poor old Robert Graves, he's always getting it. But, he's just a really convenient example. Let's begin by honouring Robert Graves, the great English poet. Yeah? Hats off, inspired soul, if ever there was, writing beautiful, brilliant, insightful, moving, powerful poetry in English, okay? Guy did a good job. But then he writes a book called The White Goddess, where his inspiration is so powerful, and this is the very charitable description, his inspiration is so powerful, his mystic insight is so energized that he just starts saying stuff that aren't true about Welsh folks and Irish folks. And so it's a really good example, mainly because of his influence. So The White Goddess, of course, it's written back in the 50s. Very powerful book, very mystical book, very spiritually potent book. Unfortunately, it's taken up by later readers as proof that there is such a thing as, for example, a Celtic tree calendar. And there isn't one, we've looked for one. There isn't a Celtic tree calendar. It doesn't exist. And the Irish ancient writing system, Ogham or Ogham in modern Irish, which has tree associations, which itself has a long and convoluted history. So there are elements of truth in what Robert Graves is saying, but his conclusions are basically massively flawed and misrepresentations. And it wouldn't be a problem if his book wasn't so popular. But because his book is so popular, we have kind of this cottage industry in modern paganism and sort of the looser, modern spiritual culture that we all share in, where, it's still taken for granted in some cases that there is such a thing as an ancient tree calendar, and there just isn't one. And that's just one example out of many that we could talk about of this misrepresentation of other people's ancestral culture, and therefore misrepresentation of their identity in them, their souls, if you like.
Yes, exactly. So I come across these misrepresentations a lot too in my teachings, and have to sort of go through a process sometimes with people of saying, here's some things that you've probably heard in, quote, modern pagan communities and circles that are actually misrepresentations. So when I do some teachings about the Ogham, for example, the Celtic tree calendar is always something that some people think is a real thing, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot here in which, that's a tangible example, but as you said, there are many. And, to ensure that people understand the greater context here, Robert Graves, as you mentioned, is English. So could you give us a brief overview of the history between Wales and England? I know this is a big question. And why this history is important to this conversation about cultural appropriation and misrepresentation.
Yeah, okay. So very briefly, 2,000 years ago, Britain is mainly a Brythonic Celtic island. Then the Romans turn up, they take over most of Britain, 400 years later, their empire starts collapsing and the Romans leave and they create a power vacuum. And into that power vacuum, other cultures and tribes turn up. So Germanic-speaking peoples turn up from the continent. They come into the power vacuum left by the retreating Roman Empire, which leads to conflict between the Celts, the ancestors of the Welsh, pretty much, and the Cornish, and the Germanic tribes, the Anglo-Saxons and the Jutes. And of course, over time, this conflict persists. And during that time, the Brythonic peoples evolve into the Welsh and the Cornish, and the Anglo-Saxons, especially after the Norman invasion, evolve into the English. And ultimately, the English become dominant. The English, after many centuries, create a viable kingdom of their own. And the Welsh kingdoms never fully create a whole kingdom of their own. And that creates a situation where England is strong enough to conquer Wales. So in 1282, England conquers Wales. Then over the preceding centuries, there's increasing levels of domination. Wales is effectively what we might call today an apartheid state. From 1282 onwards, the Welsh language is banned. If you want to get on in the world, you need to speak English. And that persists to this day where, for many Welsh speakers, we are still in this kind of forced marriage with England. We still don't have our independence. We still don't have sovereignty over our resources and our space and our culture. So we're still to this day in a situation where we're in a gradual decline. And this is where cultural appropriation today is still an issue, is that, that 100 years ago or 120 years ago, there were 1 million Welsh speakers. By today, there's like 500,000 Welsh speakers. Loads of the Celtic sister languages have been decimated in Ireland, in Scottish Gaelic-speaking Scotland. Cornish and Manx disappear. Breton in northern France is under pressure. Welsh survives as the healthiest of the Celtic languages, but we are still in a situation where we're still a conquered nation and there are increasing pressures on Welsh language. I mean, it's a complicated situation because, I'm married to an English woman. Many of my friends are English folks, but there is a sense that more and more English speakers keep moving into Wales and not learning the language. When I was in school, I would be able to play in Welsh with my friends. Today, in our village, most kids don't speak Welsh. They can speak Welsh, but they play in English. So my kids, for example, even though they can speak Welsh, are growing up playing in English and largely forming their relationships in English. So our situation isn't great. It's much better than the other Celtic nations. But that means that when we look at people from elsewhere on the planet coming to our culture and being fascinated by it, and, it's great, it's being inspired by it and being influenced by it, it's very easy for that influence to become appropriation and misrepresentation. And therefore we feel like, well, the English-speaking world has taken so much from us and continues to take a lot from us. Why are you taking the jewels of our soul, our myth, our stories? Well, and I'm not saying there's an easy answer because, most of us are trying to live peaceful lives, but there is a tension and it's not easily resolved. So that's why it's still a problem today.
Yes, thank you so much for speaking to that. And as you said, there's so much complexity here. And so it's beautiful to have this conversation and try to tease out some of these threads, which feel so important. And, what I notice there's two perspectives I can bring here, the perspective of the American and the perspective of someone who, I largely grew up in England. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of hold that dual identity and can see into both cultures. And what I notice, let's say on the English side, is that a lot of English people who get curious about, our heritage and ancestry as a people, we often go to the Welsh traditions going, well, that's our Celtic roots. Those are our Celtic roots. And so we have to go to the Welsh traditions to understand ourselves. And this is problematic, I feel. And I've really sat with this question so much of like how how to honor who I am and we are as an English people, because we do have Celtic roots, Brythonic roots. And also, we are very much evolved beyond that place. And we have so many influences. We have the Anglo-Saxon influence, the Viking influence, there are many influences. So we have a really complex history and heritage. And so on this path, I've really come to a place of trying to respectfully determine where the boundaries are between Welsh and English traditions. Where do they begin and end? And of course, there are places that are interwoven, like inseparable, but also there are places of divergence too. So it's been quite a process to sit with this, to try to differentiate between the cultures, let's say when we're looking at medieval texts. I'm curious to hear your perspective on this, because I've really sat with this, but I would really love to hear it from your perspective as a Welsh person. So for example, how do we differentiate between the two cultures when we're looking at medieval texts? Do Welsh deities and Welsh mythology firmly belong to the Welsh traditions, and are there any exceptions?
How do we distinguish between the two traditions, and are there elements of Welsh myth which are also pertinent to the English tradition? That's the question, yeah?
Yes.
Well, it's relatively straightforward to distinguish between the two traditions in that one is written in Welsh and the other is written in English. Very simply, Welsh sources are Welsh sources and English sources are English. When we think of mythology, as in, not just discrete stories, but more like a large and extended web network of characters, symbols, and narratives that are all interrelated and sort of overlapping in many ways. Mythology is often presented to us as like a finished text in a book, but that's just a snapshot of a living, evolving cultural phenomena that has a more fluid and flexible and, living being, if you like. So Welsh myth, that network of connections, of course, in many ways, it connects to and overlaps with many other traditions. The Irish, the Cornish, the Manx, the Scottish Gaelic, the Breton, but also with the English. We've been living next door to each other for the last, 1600 years. Of course, there's going to be some influence, as well as there being native Brythonic traditions that may have been adopted by the Germanic incomers that then adopted them as their own traditions, and vice versa. So, for example, we see in things like the tradition of the Mari Lwyd in Wales, which is winter solstice tradition or a Christmas time tradition, where we have the horse's skull on a pole and a white sheet over the person holding the horse's skull and ribbons and bells. And there's, merrymaking and fun to be had and drinking and going around the village and singing songs. As a cultural celebration, that's very similar to the hobby horses in England, for example. We see it very clearly in similar types of folk song in both Welsh and English. Different languages, similar melodies, similar structures, similar verse forms. One of the more obvious examples, I would say, of a distinctly mythological being present in both Wales and England is, and this is sort of research work I did over a period of time, being able to identify Arawn in the first branch of the Mabinogi as a version of the magical huntsman archetype, and seeing Herne the Hunter in England as another version of this magical huntsman archetype. We see it in Arthurian myth. Arthurian myth is appropriated, if you like, or borrowed by the Anglo-Norman culture of England from Wales, and it flourishes as a mythology in an Anglo-Norman context, in Norman French, and then in English. So we share mythologies, we share traditions, similar traditions, but they're also distinct in the sense that we have a distinct tradition in Wales and we have a distinct tradition in England. And I suppose that even though there are connections and similarities, the gravitational pull of both traditions is strong enough for us to be able to separate them and distinguish them.
Yes, thank you. That was a really beautiful explanation. I was going to mention the Arthurian myths because I feel that You know, as you said, King Arthur is rooted in Wales and also Cornwall, as far as I understand, and also Scotland. But I feel like the Arthurian legends and King Arthur kind of stretch across the whole island. And there's so many places in England that are named after Arthurian characters and what have you. And so that feels like a point of a common meeting point for all of the cultures across, Britain. More than anything, like what I try to encourage people to do is to really be discerning, right? To actually put some thought into this and to pay attention to what feels in integrity and what doesn't. And I think this conversation is helpful because it kind of provides a map for people to feel into that for themselves. Like what feels in integrity if you're, let's say, English and you're wanting to connect with your English heritage, right? And as you're speaking to as well, it's really beautiful to compare and contrast between the different cultures, because there are certain motifs and themes and traditions that are very similar, right? And so for those of us who are English, I feel like our heritage often feels really fragmented. And so sometimes it's helpful to find a little clue from the lands we call England and then compare it with Wales and Scotland and maybe Ireland as well. And then go, oh, okay, I can see where this little breadcrumb I found actually probably has a morsel of truth because of what is happening all around us. It's sort of like putting a puzzle together. At least that's been my experience. And so beautiful to chat with you about it.
Yeah, for sure. You were talking about the puzzle pieces that we have to bring together sometimes to try and understand what it is that we're after, and that we need some kind of discernment to understand how we should arrange these puzzle pieces and how we should consider them. Are they valid parts of this tradition we're trying to construct for ourselves, or are they modern inspired dreamings that we can be influenced by, but they don't relate to the historical part of the tradition we're trying to create? And the creation of tradition is something that we're involved in, ultimately, because, like I said at the beginning, most of the spiritual focus and energy of our respective cultures is taken up by Christianity, which is a viable and powerful mythology and set of beliefs all in its own right. Obviously has its shadow and its problems, but, Jesus said, let's love each other and be at peace. So in that sense, I've got a lot, of admiration for that tradition. But fundamentally, when we're trying to find what we might call the earlier native tradition prior to and beyond Christianity, then we don't have such obvious lineage keepers, if you like. We don't have such obvious people to turn to. There are no churches or priests or Bibles that we can go to and say, hey, what is my religious tradition, So in that sense, for the last, few hundred years, we've all been in this permanent state of having to create these traditions for ourselves if we want to have some kind of viable spiritual, or I would say intensely cultural connection to our ancestors and our people. And therefore, I think it's really important that we continue to return to the sources. This is kind of my work, to present the actual sources. And even though it's not easy, and sometimes it's not what you want, it's not provided for you on a silver platter, there you go, it's all ready for you. You've got to do the work yourself to a degree. I think it's far more rewarding, and you'll probably find this yourself, Tara, that there's a lot to be gained from spending time and trying to understand the actual sources, in my case, the Celtic sources themselves. And therefore, when we're trying to piece together this tradition for ourselves, when we're trying to take up the mantle, if you like, of what would this tradition look like for us, therefore, I think it's important that to begin with, that we're aware of what it is that we're doing, and, that we're conscious of the deficiencies in our situation, of what's not possible and what is possible, that we're wary of appointing too many obvious leaders and priests too soon, because the matter hasn't been settled or formalized in a communal sense within the Celtic nations, never mind outside the Celtic nations. We have a tradition of Druidry in Wales, but it's a Christian tradition. There is a tradition of Druidry in England, which is almost just as old, a couple hundred years old. But that's a tradition that's evolved in its own right in an English-speaking context that doesn't have much to do with Welsh culture, as far as I can tell. So I think we've got to be careful of giving too much power and authority to these organizations. And it needs to be a far more anarchic, grassroots relationship where we do the work for ourselves as much as possible. Obviously, we need help. We need guides. We need people who know stuff. We need to listen to people who've sat with these materials for a few decades and, put in the work and the hours to understand them. We need scholarship. We need historians. We need anthropologists. We need people with an interest in these things. But I think we need to be cautious about putting the cart before the horse too much. Spiritual traditions arise out of communities. They're not spoken out of the words of priests. Yeah, it's a communal relationship that we should be looking for. And let's see what happens, before we start saying it's one thing or another. I hope that's clear for people. I really want people to go to the actual sources, find out for yourself, make your own mind up about what they mean, talk to other people about what it means, and let's build a community of understanding before we start, making claims to religion, basically. That's my point.
And it's such an important point. And I think that so many people are drawn to these traditions and this path of spirituality as a way of life because they don't want something that's hierarchical. They don't want something that tells you this is right and this is wrong, right? Because we have enough of that in our world. And we can see that there's a lot of downfalls with that kind of way of approaching spirituality because of the church. So I think what really resonated for me is that grassroots movement, but also the importance of putting in the work. And this is something that I say a lot to American folks and people in the diaspora is like, we have to put in extra work because we don't belong to these cultures. And it's important to uplift the voices of those who belong to these lands, such as yourself. And that's what I aim to do with this podcast. I only interview people who are from the Celtic nations and from England as well, because I understand the importance of, people who are born in the culture and living on the land having a voice and being the leading voice. And it's really interesting too, as someone from the diaspora, because our pathway to these traditions is different. There is more work for us to do to understand and be in right relationship and to be in reciprocity too. Again, there's so much complexity here. And I'm sure, the influence of the diaspora on, let's say, you in Wales is complex because I imagine there are many people coming to you from, as you said, America, Canada, Australia, saying, I want to learn about my traditions. And then I'm sure that there's complexity around how you then have to teach. And I'm actually curious about your perspective about that. Do you have any feelings around how people from the diaspora can approach these teachings with a deeper sense of respect and reverence and reciprocity?
Well, first of all, just to say thank you, for the way you're doing this, because I feel like you've got a lot of integrity in what you're doing. And then the second thing is, maybe it's just because I'm incredibly lucky, but everybody who comes on my courses, they're all lovely and they're very respectful and they're very sensible and and everybody knows what's going on. And I've hardly ever had any major issues with people any more than you would in any other group of people. Yeah. So obviously I've found myself in this line of work where I'm trying to tailor my experience of my own culture and, informed by my academic training in university, in my doctorate, and in my sort of formal work as a researcher in various, situations, trying to tailor all of that to kind of building a bridge, I suppose. Because I sincerely believe that, we are one humanity and it's important that we've got wherever we can build bridges, let's build bridges, And I think that one thing that doesn't come up a lot, it used to come up a lot in the earlier days. I started this work, 10 years ago now, as a independent sort of researcher and tutor. When I started teaching, there was a kind of a sense that I could provide a whole and finished tradition for people to step into. And some people were let down when they realized, no, I'm asking far more of you than that. Because it's not that easy. Yeah. If I'm asking other people not to misrepresent my tradition, then I'm definitely not going to misrepresent it. You know, where I find the connection to spirituality in my own tradition, where I find the spirit in my tradition, if you like, is sometimes difficult to translate for people, yeah, because it's in a different language and it doesn't always work in English. Because a lot of it's in poetry, funnily enough, you know, as having a bardic tradition. But then for the people that did stick around, and for the people that have stuck around for years now, you know, like I've got a core of people who keep coming back. I think that we're all learning together that we can create cultural, spiritual meaning for ourselves through these materials. And that there is a way of doing that, whether you're part of the diaspora or you live in Wales or you're from South America of Oriental lineage. I mean, it doesn't, you know, humans are humans. Yeah. If you put the time and the energy and the effort in, you will connect to something, like it's inevitable. The other thing that needs to be said, though, is that what I feel like we need more so these days, the more my work evolves and progresses and the kind of the deeper we go, the more I feel like we do need actual spiritual practice. And spiritual is kind of an unfortunate term here in many ways, because what we're really talking about is a kind of psychological practice that's prior to spiritual practice, which is self-reflection, self-knowledge, self-understanding, seeing ourselves in relation to these materials. Because I think that that's where the real value is. And I think that's what people are really after. You know, we're after something that's going to help us grow. We're after something that's going to help us get in touch with parts of ourselves we didn't know were there. We want to grow up as mature, cultural and spiritual people. And so to do that, just reading the sources isn't enough. You know, like the stories are good, like the myths are good, the study of myth, the discipline of studying myth and interpretation and symbolic meaning is very rich and nourishing and really good, but it's not enough if you want a spiritual path in the modern sense. And so, you know, having to try and address that need, if you like, is a bit more difficult, because that's where our traditions break down. Yeah. That's where we are having to look at other traditions and see what other people are doing to try and understand what was going on in our own tradition a long time ago, where we've only got like vague hints and clues and ideas as to what the practices were that helped people mature spiritually. They're there, like they're definitely there, but it's difficult to tease them out and present them in a modern context that makes sense to people, I suppose, is the, you know, just to be frank about it and blunt about it, you know.
Yeah, thank you for speaking to that. That's something that I really strive to do in my work, is to really root into the source material and the traditions and what we do know, and then sort of fill in the gaps, naming that we're filling in the gaps with spiritual practice and what could that look like in a modern context. So yeah, that's something I feel really passionately about. And I think I do relatively well. People in my courses can tell me if that's true or not. But as you said, that's really what people are looking for. People are looking for a transformative experience that helps them to understand themselves, helps them to mature, helps them to be initiated into deeper aspects of self. And I feel like there's such a deep remembering there, because at least this is my sense, and obviously this is just my perspective, but I feel like our ancestors were engaging with heritage in ways that did help them to initiate into the maturest parts of themselves, like more mature parts of themselves. And that's what we've lost because we have a fractured lineage. And the church was all about sin and attorning for sins rather than actually looking at, say, the darker parts of our humanity and the darker parts of ourselves, and actually relating to the world around us in ways that allow us to mature beyond those shadowy parts of ourselves. Yeah, I feel really passionately about the Grail mysteries. And there's a really beautiful Grail story by a German author. His name's Wolfram. So in Wolfram's version, there's a very clear maturing process that happens in Percival. where the loathly lady, Kundry, in Wolfram's version, she basically scolds Percival for being unfeeling and for not showing compassion and basically for being immature. And through this scolding, he has this tantrum, and then he basically goes on this quest. And along this quest, he is initiated and he matures. And at the end of the story, in Wolfram's version, Kundry gives him a blessing, basically saying, "You've done a great job transforming yourself." And I love this story because I feel like, again, that's what so many people are longing for, is to really engage with our heritage and these teachings in ways that do transform us. So I just wanted to give that example from mythology because it feels important and it feels really powerful to reflect on those kinds of themes. And I'm actually curious, Gwilym, if you have an example from the Welsh traditions of a transformative story that people could connect with in this vein of transforming ourselves through our heritage.
Well, there's a few. I mean, just to maybe if we can take a step back and, we can go from Percival's story to a slightly closer English story, closer to us in Wales. That's the story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. A story heavily influenced by Welsh elements, like lots of the Arthurian stories are. Another, medieval story of transformation and maturing and learning and initiation. And then the obvious one, through that lineage, if you like, we're coming through Percival, through Sir Gawain. We end up with Pwyll in the first branch of the Mabinogi. These are all medieval stories trying to teach the same basic type of wisdom. Engagement with the world is how we grow. And, that there's a spiritual nourishment in the various encounters that we can have. But interestingly, many of these encounters are had in the wild. It's a motif or a trope even, young man goes on adventure, is out in the wilds, outside of society, outside of civilization. And it's in the wilds that supernature makes its presence felt. And for the ancient mind, nature is supernatural. It's not just the mundane realm of being that we inhabit, but it's greater. There's a greater network of possibility and meaning and reality beyond what we perceive. And therefore, in that place, the encounter with the supernatural is often framed in these stories, as just as you quite eloquently put it. It's an encounter ultimately with parts of ourselves that need maturing. And this is an ancient understanding. It's an ancient philosophy. It's not just we don't just see it in the Celtic lands, in the Celtic traditions, see it in loads of places. There needs to be an encounter with something which helps us transcend our notion of what it is to be human, or transcend the mundane human to grow, to become something greater. Perhaps, dare I say it, and this is my own take, to witness humanity as a multi-generational being, that we aren't just, these discrete generations that arise and fall, but that we are perhaps one being that lives through multiple generations, and that we are greater than ourselves in that sense. And to have that perspective on our life on this planet, might help us a bit to think of ourselves as living beyond our own generations, but into the future, and living through our spoken word, our words taken up by our descendants. We become the ancestors, they become the speakers of our words. And so the story continues in the future. It's like this. I know I'm kind of going off on a tangent now, but it's this idea of time fundamentally, which is at the core of many Celtic myths, at the core of many Welsh stories, Welsh folk tales, transcending time, the crisis that's presented in our inability to last long enough as limited mortal beings that we are. That crisis is addressed through storytelling, through mythology, with this wisdom of time, of the, memory persists, culture persists, we persist through culture into the future. And therefore, the tale of Taliesin is another brilliant example where the young Gwilym dies. He goes through these different animal transformations. He dies or he's killed by the great goddess Ceridwen, and then she gives birth to him again, and he is reincarnated, but still in possession of all the memory, all the magical inspiration he received in his former life. Now, whether you believe in reincarnation or not, or perhaps it's just a simple symbolic illustration of how culture works, either way, it's still a powerful story of initiation into that understanding, that through our cultures and our languages, we're multi-generational beings that persist across the generations.
That feels like a beautiful place to end this conversation. I feel so grateful for those words and that sense of lineage and that sense of time and memory that we all ultimately belong to. And it's really beautiful to feel the energies of transformation and maturing as a core aspect of our experience here as humans and the core experience of our heritage. And I feel like what we talked about earlier around cultural appropriation and misrepresentation, those topics to me are an invitation to mature, to actually put in the thought and the intention to relate to these traditions with that reverence, with that respect. And there isn't one clear answer. And if we can come into a sense of integrity and we really reflect deeply, then our connection with these traditions only deepens and also respects where they've come from and the people who continue these traditions today and continue the language today, like yourself. So thank you so much for this conversation. Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to add to finish?
Oh, so many things that we could continue to talk about, eh? I suppose I just like to encourage people to enjoy themselves. Enjoy the work, enjoy the study, enjoy getting in touch with these sources, and don't worry too much. Be inspired. Just be clear about what your inspiration is, I suppose.
And would you like to take a moment to tell people where they can find you and find your work?
So I mainly teach at the moment through the website, celticsource.online. I'm actually, if you went to the website now, you'd see loads of videos up there of, lectures and stuff I've given in the past, but I'm currently not taking on any new students at the moment because we're quite full up. But, in the future, you're more than welcome to get in touch and ask if there's something you can take part in.
Wonderful. And you're also on Instagram and YouTube, is that right?
I'm mainly on YouTube. I try to be on Instagram and Facebook and all the places, but to be honest with you, life's just a bit too short, isn't it? There's lots of other things that need doing too.
Thank you so much, Gwilym. Yeah, deep gratitude for this conversation. And just want to invite us to just close our eyes for a brief moment, honoring those ancestors who have shown up for us in this conversation, supported this conversation. I really have felt their presence throughout and want to offer my deep gratitude. And once again, imagining ourselves around that great fire, sitting in circle together with our ancestors, honoring all of the beautiful wisdom that has come down to us from our lineage, from our heritage, feeling that gratitude. Because despite the fact that we do come from a fractured lineage, there's so much beauty and so much truth for us to connect with. And that is because of our ancestors and because of the ones who walk this earth now in devotion to these ways. So deep gratitude. Thank you all so much for listening and sending lots of love until our next episode.
You've been listening to Dreaming the Ancestors with Tara Brading. My passion is connecting women to the wisdom of their ancestors, specializing in ancestral feminine wisdom from Ireland and England. If you feel called to connect with your Irish ancestry in an embodied, spiritual, feminine way, I lovingly invite you to sign up for my free reclamation journey, which includes a 90-minute video to connect with your Irish ancestry and ancient heritage. And if you hear the call to connect with your English ancestry, I have a 3-hour introductory workshop called Women of the Welsh. You can find these offerings at tara-wild.com/get started. To spell that out, that's TARA-WILD.com/get started.